Welcome to this lecture on civil rights and American history, the history and controversy of Confederate monuments for the undergraduate course on African American civil rights from Reconstruction to present. Lynchburg's Confederate Monument is located on Monument Terrace in the center of the city. This particular Confederate monument was dedicated on May 4th, 1900, right across the street from the old city courthouse, which now houses the Lynchburg Museum. As with most Confederate monuments and memorials, the United Daughters of the Confederacy was responsible for funding and commissioning the statue. Again, as with most Confederate monuments, the Our Confederate Soldiers Monument was not designed or sculpted by a local artist, but was outsourced and was cast by a German sculptor, Ferdinand von Miller of Munich, Germany, one of only 3 Confederate monuments that he created. The other 2 were in Louisville, Kentucky, and Raleigh, North Carolina, but both have since been removed. Most Confederate statues were mass produced by companies who simply changed the belt buckles from USA to CSA as they produced statues for both the United States and Confederate memorials. The Lynchburg statue cost $3,000, fairly typical for its time, which was about $9,000 in today's money. The UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, raised $2,000, and the city of Lynchburg chipped in the additional $1,000 needed. The Our Confederate Soldiers Monument is very typical for its time. It has a typical structure with the statue on the top, standing on a pedestal about 20 feet high, and the pedestal on a base. As with other Confederate monuments of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including the Confederate monument that was recently removed in Charlottesville, there is reported to be a time capsule in the base of this monument that reportedly contains a lock of traveler's hair, that was Robert E. Lee's horse, some photographs of Confederate veterans from Lynchburg, a casualty of the Confederate Lynchburg dead, and a poem entitled The Nation's Ward, an N-word. As with other Confederate monument dedications of the time, the dedication of Our Confederate Soldier was a major celebratory event, which included a massive parade that had Confederate veterans marching in it. There was an installation speech that lasted 1.5 hours and glorified the Old South and the Confederate cause. And the speech was given by Senator John W. Daniel, who was not only a U.S. Senator from Lynchburg, but a Confederate war veteran himself. There was also a choir of about 2,000 children singing old Southern favorite like Dixie's Land and Bonnie Blue Flag. The ceremony closed with poetry read by famous poet Cordelia Jordan, who wrote poetry about death and grief, but also about glorifying the Old South. The ceremony then closed with a song, America, and a benediction by Reverend Tazewell McCorkle of the Third Presbyterian Church. The context of the Lynchburg dedication is simply an example of the hundreds of Confederate war monument dedications that happened from the 1890s through the 1920s, when over 90% of Confederate war monuments were dedicated. It's also important to understanding the controversy surrounding these monuments and the historic struggle for African American civil rights and the now debunked but increasingly popular lost cause mythology. In recent years, these monuments have come under intense scrutiny, beginning in 2015 after the massacre at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and again after the death of George Floyd in 2020. Many people would like to see these statues contextualized, removed, or even placed in museums, while others argue that they are history and should be left alone. The center of the controversy is the origin of these statues. Why were they built? What was their purpose? There is much about the history of these statues that can help to inform our opinions on this topic. Statues and monuments honoring the Confederate dead were almost immediately created following the Civil War, but the placement and dedications were very different than what occurred after the 1890s. Many monuments created directly after the war were typically placed in cemeteries and were places of solemn memorialization. The occasion of their dedication was very solemn, and dedication speeches focused on the tragedy and loss accompanied by war and defeat. These memorials, like the obelisk that you see here, dedicated in Lynchburg's Old City Cemetery in 1869, were necessary because many families in the Civil War never had their loved ones' remains returned to them. They did not have closure, and these monuments provided some of that closure for them, somewhere for them to go and to grieve their losses. However, the dedications of the monuments after 1890 were much different affairs, beginning with the organization responsible for their creation. The United Daughters of the Confederacy was founded in 1894, and they were primarily responsible for the funding and creation of many of the Confederate memorials throughout the South in the 1890s and the early 20th century. They were also responsible for promulgating the lost cause ideology of the Old South, the idea of the benevolent masters and the contented enslaved people. Additionally, the lost cause mythology buried fairly successfully the idea that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. And they rewrote Southern history to argue that the South's cause was one of states' rights. It was a noble and just cause. This philosophy took root in schools across the South in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. It was popularized in a 1915 blockbuster movie by D.W. Griffith called The Birth of a Nation. In 1914 as well, the Daughters of the Confederacy advocated for the creation of a comprehensive history of the Ku Klux Klan to be placed in libraries and schools across the South to educate the people of the bravery and honor of the Ku Klux Klan as the saviors of Southern society from African American and Yankee domination. The Daughters of the Confederacy called the Confederate soldiers the original Ku Klux, the original men of bravery and honor. We can also gain a clearer understanding as to the purpose of the monuments based on their construction and their placement. The size of the statue and its placement on tall pedestals symbolizes the high ideal of the Confederate soldier, that the lost cause ideology of states' rights, honor, and valor. Perhaps even more symbolic than the stance on the pedestal is the laurel wreath at the top of the pedestal that you can see over here. I'm trying to point to it with the letters in the center CSA. The laurel wreath is a Greek symbol for victory, and the laurel wreath can be found on many, if not most, Confederate statues throughout the South. It's often absent from the earlier statues and memorials that were dedicated in the first 20 years following the Civil War. Since the Confederacy lost the Civil War, it begs the question, over what are Southerners claiming victory? What victory were they celebrating in 1900 and in the 1890s and in the 19 teens at these monuments' dedication? The context of the time period may better help us to understand this particular inconsistency. Immediately following the Civil War, the United States entered into the period of Reconstruction, where the U.S. government attempted to rebuild the southern states to include African American civil and political rights. Southerners viewed this time period as an unwelcome and corrupt occupation by federal forces, upending social and political norms and hierarchy. In 1868, Virginia rewrote their entire constitution under Republican leadership that had been elected by both black and white, rich and poor Virginians in a time of unprecedented democracy in the South. This 1868 Constitution protected the voting and civil rights of newly freed men and poor Southern whites. However, Reconstruction ended in the late 1870s, and the Supreme Court made several decisions turning the protection of civil and voting rights over to the states. In the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, the United States Supreme Court ruled that segregation was constitutional, and by 1900, Jim Crow laws and segregation were firmly entrenched in most Southern states. Social hierarchies were reestablished, lynchings became commonplace, and civil and voting rights were denied to Black and poor Southern whites. In 1902, Virginia rewrote their state constitution, with active assistance from Senator Daniel, the installation speaker at the dedication of the Lynchburg Monument. One of the stated purposes of this new constitution, as you can see from the document on the screen, was to disenfranchise Virginia's nearly 100,000 plus registered African American voters and to reestablish white supremacy in a successful effort to replace the Reconstruction Constitution of 1868, which some Virginia Assemblymen referred to as the N-word Constitution. As of 1902, Virginia had claimed victory over Reconstruction, victory over African American civil and political participation, reducing Black voting rolls to 10,000 people. The laurel wreath may have been to also symbolize the victory of reestablishing white supremacy in the South. Additionally, the placement of these monuments is quite instructive. Most were placed in prominent places, primarily across the street from the city courthouse. According to UVA historians who are experts in Confederate monuments, Andrea Douglas and Jelaine Schmidt, this placement was strategic as the courthouse was typically in the center of the city and symbolized the political and legal strength of the city. The history we just discussed can be instructive here that African Americans were no longer protected politically or legally. The placement of these statues in front of the courthouse was a stark reminder to a southern city's Black population of who exactly was in control of a city's political and legal strength, as can be demonstrated by the Confederate monument in front of the old Roanoke courthouse. The wreath symbolized this victory of white supremacy's political goals. The South was for the white Southerner, and unlike the solemn mood that accompanied a defeated Confederacy in the 1860s and 70s, the celebration and the jubilation at the installation of these monuments was different. While Confederate veterans may have desired to create belated memorials in their waning years, the speeches and songs sung at these dedications in the 1900s left little in doubt. Singing Bonnie Blue Flag at the dedication of the Lynchburg Monument, it included the defiant lyrics, "Fighting for our property we gained by honest toil, and when our rights were threatened, the cry rose near and far, hurrah for the bonnie blue flag that bears a single star. Then here's to our Confederacy, strong we are and brave, like patriots of old we'll fight our heritage to save." True to the lyrics of the song, Southern white people did fight against Reconstruction with the Ku Klux Klan's reign of terror and the implementation of white supremacy through lynching, Jim Crow, disenfranchisement, and mass incarceration. For many, these statues represented their triumph over Reconstruction and a restoration of white supremacy. With this context, and in our unfortunate American civil rights history, what role do these statues continue to play in the 21st century? Should they be removed, contextualized, or left alone? For many in the African American community and their allies, they continue to symbolize and glorify America's racist heritage and thus have no place in the public square. For white Southerners, their removal is a threat to history, family, and heritage. While hundreds of statues have been removed, hundreds of statues remain along with their controversy. Thank you.